as we leave 2023 behind, I think it's safe to say it's been a pretty crazy year for gaming, or at least it was for me. There were tons of exciting new releases and sequels to things I was looking forward to, and unfortunately not enough time to check it all out. But more importantly, there was one title in particular that I, and probably many others, were thinking about more and more as the year went on. In a year that was already looking so stacked, wrapping it up with a release date for one of the most anticipated sequels on Steam would have been a perfect way to cap off the year. Though unfortunately that didn't end up happening. But for the sake of not putting off this video any longer, I think now is probably as good of a time as any to talk about a certain little indie game. Ah, Hollow Knight, an old classic. Feels weird calling it that considering the game isn't even 10 years old yet, but that aside. 7 years later, and I think that this is still some of the best that indie games have to offer. While I would have loved for this video to cover both the original Hollow Knight and the sequel Silksong, the latter will just have to settle for its own separate video whenever we actually get the full release. And hopefully that'll come before people start selling their souls begging for anything Silksong related. But while I'm here waiting like everybody else, I felt like it might be interesting to try to put into words exactly what makes Hollow Knight such a masterpiece, and show a little appreciation for the game in my own way. So with all that said, let's start from the very beginning. Hollow Knight doesn't exactly give you much when it comes to context. The first thing you'll be greeted with when you start is a poem, written by someone named Monomon. Don't worry if you can't make sense of this because you're not really supposed to, as we'll get into later. But for now, this is just something to set the tone. After the opening cinematics, you're thrown into an area which you'll learn is called the King's Pass much later. And this is going to serve as your tutorial. Which is great and all, but if you're anything like me, you might have racked up a few unanswered questions already. We don't know who we are, we don't know where we are, and we don't even know why we're here. At least a number of those questions are going to remain up in the air for most of the game. But for now, all we're given is this.
Higher beings, these words are for you alone. Beyond this point, you enter the land of King and Creator. Step across this threshold and obey our laws. Bear witness to the last and only civilization, the Eternal Kingdom, Hallownest.
But for a place dubbed the Eternal Kingdom, I'm not sure this is what people would have pictured just past the gate. Before you reach the kingdom proper, your first real stop is a near-deserted town called Dirtmouth, and it's here you're greeted by the only resident left, someone named Elderbug. Through him, we learn that travelers from afar and even the residents of the town have disappeared into the caverns on what remains of the kingdom down below. And he assumes that we're here for the same reasons as the travelers who came before us, seeking things such as wealth, glory, or enlightenment. But most importantly, he warns you about some kind of disease that's taken over the kingdom, causing those infected with it to go mad. And with that message from Elderbug received, that's all the context we're getting for the rest of the game. Now, I'm only half joking since there will obviously be more to the story as you progress, but for the most part, this interaction with Elderbug is one of the only bits of lore that's directly spelled out for you. Hollow Knight storytelling works like this. Either don't explain anything at all, or give out just enough information to pique your curiosity. And then from there, it's up to you to make your own conclusions. All we know up until this point is that the Kingdom of Hallownest has collapsed, presumably due to that disease mentioned earlier, and now it's up to us to find out more. It's certainly an interesting approach, but one that's a little polarizing, since it can sometimes lead to you wandering around with no idea of where you should go next. But on the other hand, it's an approach that complements the world and atmosphere almost perfectly. Compared to other games where everything revolves around your actions and unfolds with you as a catalyst for the story existing at all, here, the story is finished, just has yet to be told. However, for as much as I'm talking about it, this isn't really a story-driven game, at least not in the conventional sense. Due to the nature of the game and everything I just said, it can be hard to follow what's happening with the story sometimes. This is one of those games where you can go through from start to finish and still end up needing to watch a video explaining what you just went through, and to some degree, that's fine, provided those details actually form a narrative at some point. Almost everything in this game exists for a reason, and the visuals can set the tone better than anything they could try to explain with words. For example, the first area of the game is the Forgotten Crossroads, and this already gives off a much stronger impression of being part of a once great kingdom, at least when compared to Dirtmouth. There are signs of civilization like architecture and tools scattered about, but there's hardly anyone left to use such things anymore. For the most part, the creatures you find down here are those that haven't lost to the infection, but there are exceptions that I'll get into later. Now at this point it should be pretty obvious, but I'm going to point it out anyway. This game is quite dark, both in tone and presentation. The game's color palette is quite dark, which really drives the point home, but there is one big exception to this. When the world of Hallownest is so dark and full of negativity, naturally you would expect brighter colors to signify the opposite, right? Well, unfortunately that isn't quite the case, and the most blatant example of this is the infection. In contrast to the atmosphere so far, the infection is symbolized by this vibrant shade of orange, and considering the warnings and aftermath, the darker atmosphere becomes a much more comforting sight, because the darkness means that the infection hasn't quite taken hold yet. But if you still aren't convinced about how dangerous the infection is by now, then let me introduce you to Myla. When you first meet her, she'll be mining for treasure and singing songs to herself, and even inviting you to join in. But after you visit her enough, you'll notice that her demeanor starts to change. She'll start to forget the words to her song. And soon after, she'll stop mining. And then eventually, she's lost to the infection as well, as indicated by the eyes. And unfortunately, at this point, there's no way to save her. Which really only leaves us with one option. What Hollow Knight doesn't explicitly say, it shows us in a way that will be memorable. But despite the grim reality, there are still signs of life that haven't quite died out yet. The warning we got from Elderbug painted a picture of the tragedy that came to Hallownest, but it's only when we start exploring ourselves that we understand the extent of it all. Myla is our reminder that this world is dying, and just barely holding on. But there are many others who haven't quite given up on Hallownest just yet. Sly was succumbing to the infection before he brought him back to his senses, and after that, he returns to Dirtmouth as a merchant, and he's far from the only shopkeeper we'll meet down here. There are explorers still traveling through the kingdom despite the danger, like Cornfur and Quirrell. And on the other hand, there are warriors actively seeking out the danger, like Cloth. Hell, there is even Millabelle the Scamp. I mean banker, just a totally normal banker. And this is only scratching the surface. There are plenty of even stranger characters inhabiting the land. I also want to give a special mention to the last stag, who I can only really describe as our tour guide and doubling as our tour bus. The last of his kind, still ready at a moment's notice to take travelers across the kingdom even when the stagways haven't been used in ages. And I can't help but think that if Myla is symbolic of the approaching doom, then in a way I suppose the last stag could be symbolic of hope for the future. This point becomes especially apparent after you reach the stag nest, and curiously there happens to be a broken eggshell here. And after telling the last stag about it, he rejoices that he might not be the last of his kind, and with this newfound discovery comes a new name, and the belief that his people have left Hallownest in search of new horizons. While the dour atmosphere is almost always present, the environments you'll find yourself in and the creatures you encounter can vary wildly. Greenpath will probably be your next stop after you finish your business at the crossroads, but here is where the game starts to show off just how different the game can feel. Sprawling greenery and rays of light shining from above definitely give off a different vibe at first, but that sense of loneliness is still present in the background, at least until you encounter this character. Now, something I haven't gotten to talk about just yet is the gameplay, and while there is a lot that I've glossed over, my reasoning is that personally, up until this point, I don't think the gameplay is anything special. The first couple of bosses look like this, and I'll say that, yeah, this isn't exactly the most appropriate place to talk about how good the combat can be. But when you get to Greenpath, aside from all the other random exploring you'll be doing, you're also going to be chasing this mystery character for a while, until you finally catch up with her and you're greeted with a boss fight. This is Hornet, and in my opinion, the first real boss fight of the game. Mostly because Pulse Knight is technically optional. Now, the simplest way I could describe the combat in this game is easy to pick up and hard to master. The controls are really easy to understand at the beginning. You can jump, slash in 4 directions, and charge a heal. You'll unlock various movement upgrades later, like a dash and a double jump, alongside new spells and attacks to keep things fresh. But for the most part, combat stays relatively easy to understand. Though thankfully, the game has other ways to make combat interesting. Hollow Knight gets a lot of mileage out of its combat, mainly through its enemy and boss design. Every boss feels unique, and because our options are somewhat limited, it lets them create bosses that have to be approached in a specific way. Almost every boss has to have a strategy made specifically for them, and because of that, the game can be pretty difficult, but overall it's a very consistent experience, meaning no huge difficulty spikes. I would say that almost every boss is well designed, obviously there are some outliers here and there, but overall I would never consider the game unfair. There was never a moment where I thought that the game was asking too much of me. Even in the moments where I died, I was never left wondering what killed me or how was I supposed to avoid that. And because of that, there was never a time where I died where I felt like I didn't deserve it. Other than this moment, I guess, but even then, I still felt like I could have done something. If you didn't see what hit me, same. But that one moment aside, the game does a pretty good job of helping you learn the fight as you go. Every hit you take is 1 point of health, or 2 depending on the fight. This means you're never going to die in one hit, and this gives you at least a little time to make a plan. Learning the individual fights is a big part of the game, but even if every fight has to be approached at least a little differently every time, after a while you'll be more comfortable with the controls and know what to expect. This means you'll at least have a few transferable skills from fight to fight. And with that idea in mind, I want to take this opportunity to highlight my favorite boss in the game, or rather bosses. In a sub-area of the Fungal Wastes, there is a place called the Mantis Village, which is one of the few areas that's been mostly spared by the infection for reasons I'm not going to get into right now. Anyways, after fighting through all the residents, you'll be met with their leaders. This fight is split up into 2 phases. In the first phase, you'll be fighting one and they have about 3 attacks that they cycle through. By the time you down them, hopefully you should have a good idea of how they fight, because after that, the next 2 come. The fight gives you ample time to learn what you should be doing before it gets too serious. But we're not quite done here yet, and I think you might be able to guess where this is going. In the post-game area of Godhome, you get to fight the bosses again at varying difficulties, and some of them even get changed a little. And when it comes to the Mantis Lords, you get this. Now, is this a hard fight? At this point in the game, no, not really, but I think it's a fun fight that never really gets old. Sisters of Battle is a no-nonsense, think on your feet kind of boss, and probably the best example of where mastering the basics will get you. Everything from movement, planning, reaction speed, and more are put to the test in a tight, fast-paced environment that comes together beautifully when done right. And it's a fight I find myself going back to replay every now and then. Now, obviously there are harder bosses and plenty of others that are fan favorites for different reasons, but if I were to go into all of them, we would be here all day. So really quick, some honorable boss mentions will include Dung Defender, because, I mean, just look at him, do I need to say more? Nosk for suddenly turning this game into a horror game, and 3 massive spoiler fights that I'm not going to show, but I will abbreviate as NKG, PV, and AR. If you know, you know. If you don't, you can just play the game or look them up. Even outside of gameplay, everything is incredibly polished to an almost insane degree, even disregarding the fact that this game was essentially made by 4 people. From the characters to the lore to the gameplay, it feels like they didn't cut corners on anything, even though they could probably afford to. And if there's anything I would call a welcome surprise, it would be the Path of Pain. Hollow Knight is a platformer, but not a dedicated one like Celeste for example. Movement upgrades in this game are more geared towards exploration and combat, and any mandatory platforming is relatively light. But after you've unlocked every movement upgrade and made your way to the White Palace, there will be an optional side area waiting for you called the Path of Pain. And true to its name, this place hurts, if you couldn't tell by all the thorns here, and all the saw blades here. Now, if the Sisters of Battle and final bosses are going to be your last challenge in terms of combat, then all this is your final test in terms of platforming. Now, for the most part, Hollow Knight has a decent skill ceiling for platforming, but it's not something that's explored too much. The groundwork is there with things like air dashing, wall jumps, and this, which people call pogoing, but heavy platforming sections just aren't that common, for better or for worse. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this section is completely optional, and it's only really there for people really seeking a challenge. If you were expecting a big reward at the end of this, well, let's just say you're in for a surprise. But just because it's optional doesn't mean it takes a hit in quality. These kind of details are for the people who want to see everything the game has to offer, and the effort doesn't go unnoticed. This game is so unreasonably ambitious in everything it sets out to do, and it's a great example of creating what you want and letting your audience find you. This many years later, and there are still people theorizing, discovering, and dissecting new lore in a way I can't really do justice in a video like this. And there are still as many people as ever speedrunning the game. Hell, even the modding community has had some crazy projects. There's been a mod in the works for a while called Hellenist Vocalized, and it finally released last year. And the mod adds full voice acting to the game with the help of over 100 volunteers from the community. Whether or not I managed to explain properly why Hollow Knight is such a big deal, it's obvious just how much people care about this game, myself included. The world of Hollow Knight is one in a million, and it's the kind of world that you're almost never going to see from a massive AAA developer. Instead, all it took was a couple of guys from Australia pouring their time and effort into a passion project. And as it turns out, when the developer puts their heart into a vision they truly care about, they might just attract an audience who cares even more.